Network, host of the African History Network show. I'm a talk show host, researcher, lecturer, writer, and historian. So it is Tuesday, March 24th, 2020, and we're live. We're broadcasting on my Facebook fan page, the African History Network, and on my YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, as well as on Periscope, the AHN Show on Periscope, the AHN Show on Periscope. All right, so I wanted to deal with this topic here. I've talked about this in the past, and this deals with March 2nd, 1807, March 2nd, 1807. And the U.S. Congress abolished the international transatlantic slave trade. Okay, it passed Congress and then goes into effect January 1st, 1808. So I want to deal with this history, and this also ties into some of the history of the Amistad Slave Ship. Many of us saw the movie Amistad, which came out, I think it was 1997 when the movie Amistad came out. But many of us remember in the movie, there was a court case, right? So the case of the Amistad goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. And one of the reasons why I went to the U.S. Supreme Court is based upon what took place March 2nd, 1807. And this ties into the history of the U.S. Constitution as well. So everybody share this broadcast on your social media platforms. Invite your friends to tune in. This is going to be a real history lesson. Then also, if you like this type of information, you can donate to the African History Network, paypal.me/the AHN Show, or through Cash App, $, the AHN Show through Cash App, $, the AHN Show through Cash App. Then also at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, click on the yellow donate button. Then African American business owners, post the name of your business here on the thread of the broadcast. Also, we'll let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network. All right, so you know, a lot of times people talk about the history of slavery in this country, dealing with the transatlantic slave trade. Oftentimes, this piece of history is left out, and if you hear me, if you see some of my presentations, you see my lectures, you listen to my radio show, the African History Network show, I talk about the need for us to understand history and law, and also the need for us to read and understand the U.S. Constitution, because the foundation of law in this country is the U.S. Constitution. And Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution tells you that the U.S. Constitution, all of the previous treaties and all of the subsequent treaties are the supreme law of the land, okay? So oftentimes, a lot of the problems that we have is because we don't understand history and law. And then when we understand history and law, that tells us which direction to go in politics. And when you hear me talk about principles of political self-defense and understanding how laws and policies impact the economic conditions of African Americans, and understanding how politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement, this ties right into that. All of this intersects, okay? So in 1807, the U.S. Congress joined with Great Britain in abolishing the African slave trade, or the international African slave trade. Although the trading of African people as slaves within the U.S. was still legal, it was not prohibited, okay? So when they're talking about abolishing the international transatlantic slave trade, that means the importation of Africans into this country as slaves. Great Britain is going to abolish that. At different periods of time, you're going to have different European nations that abolish Africans being captured and taken into their respective countries, but they still allowed the enslavement of African people, the auctioning off of them, the selling, etc., to go on in their respective European nations at different periods of time. So despite the international ban on the importation of African slaves, Cuba continued to transport captive Africans to its sugar plantations until the 1860s, and Brazil to its coffee plantations until the 1850s. Now, the U.S. Congress Act that passed on March 2nd, 1807, was to, quote, prohibit the importation of slaves into any port or place within the jurisdiction of the United States from any foreign kingdom, place, or country, from any foreign kingdom, place, or country. Now, you see me post the articles from EJI.org, usually pretty much each day to deal with like this day in history. So they had an article from March 2nd, 1807 dealing with this. And then also history.com has a really good article. There are a number of good articles I've read dealing with this piece of history. But history.com is a good article. March 2nd, 1807, Congress abolishes African slave trade. Okay. All right. How's everybody doing on Facebook? Riley and Parrish and Cedric, Tomanika. Okay. Everybody share this broadcast on your social media platforms. Okay. All right. So the ban is going to take place. It goes into effect January 1st, 1808. January 1st, 1808. This ban goes into effect. It passed Congress March 2nd, 1807. By the time the lawmakers acted, every state except South Carolina had already abolished the slave trade, basically the importation of Africans as slaves. Now, what takes place is, the reason why that happened is because that's based upon Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution. All right. And at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, they are debating whether or not to abolish the international transatlantic slave trade. Okay. So the spring of 1787, the Philadelphia Convention. 5 states had already abolished slavery by 1787, either abolished it fully, like Vermont, which abolishes slavery July 2nd, 1777, 10 years before the Philadelphia Convention, or they're going to outlaw the importation of Africans as slaves. So by the time the Philadelphia Convention takes place, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, I think Pennsylvania also, they had already abolished slavery in one way or another. At the Philadelphia Convention, all the states had agreed to abolish the importation of Africans, the international transatlantic slave trade, except for South Carolina. So they put a 20-year clause into the Constitution, which is Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, that the earliest that the international transatlantic slave trade could be abolished would be 1808. So if we look at Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, and a lot of people know about Section 9 of the Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution, because it deals with the Emoluments Clause. Okay. That's Article 1, Section 9, and it's I forgot which clause it is that deals with the Emoluments Clause. But if we look at Clause 1, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. That's 1808. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person. Okay, so it's saying that the earliest that law could go into effect is 1808. So this is what happens. So the legislation was promoted by President Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was at the time 1808, 1807, 1807, 1808. Thomas Jefferson is president at this time. It was promoted by him. Now, you're going to have different people promoting this for different reasons, right? Some do it for moral reasons, okay, because they're against slavery. Others do it for greed. So Thomas Jefferson was a big slave owner, and Jefferson felt that if you cut off the supply of Africans coming into the country, that will increase the value of the African slaves that are already here, which is beneficial to slave owners. Okay, so it's dealing with supply and demand. Okay, dealing with principles of supply and demand. So this is why Thomas Jefferson was advocated for it. So the legislation was promoted by President Thomas Jefferson, who called for its enactment in his 1806 State of the Union address, and who had favored acting on this issue since the 1770s. His views reflected the trend toward abolishing the international slave trade, which Virginia followed by all the other states had banned or restricted since the prior decade. South Carolina, however, had reopened its trade. Okay, so, and what's going to take place is that once this law goes into effect in 1808, it becomes illegal to bring Africans into this country. You're still going to have some people who do it, though. It's still going to take place, but it's illegal. And there are court cases of white men who were caught engaging in this human trafficking, okay, because now it's illegal. The other thing that takes place is that it increases the need for like slave breeding and slave breeding farms. But there was new research that came out in, I think, 2017. I interviewed Dr. Jahi Issa and Brother Reggie Marbury, who wrote an article for blackagendareport.com that dealt with how it was a lot more Africans who were still being brought into this country than we originally thought. And when we deal with this, we realize that all those Africans that came in from January 1st, 1808 until about June 1860, when the Clotilda slave ship comes into Alabama, that's all illegal based upon the U.S. own laws. Okay, that's all illegal based upon the U.S.'s own laws. So that is a strong legal argument for reparations, because the U.S. because these people are violating the U.S. own laws. It's illegal. Prior to that, it was all legal. But you're going to have European nations that sign treaties that make it illegal to go and capture slaves also. The Anglo-Spanish treaties of 1817 and 1835 deal with this. And then when I'm going to talk a little bit about the Amistad Slave Ship, when we talk about the Amistad Slave Ship and that U.S. Supreme Court case of 1841, when you study that, you find out that those Africans being captured in Sierra Leone, that violated all the existing treaties at the time. Okay, archives.gov talks about this, the National Archives, and they have the information right on their website, right on the front page of their website. When you search for the Amistad case, it tells you in February of 1839, Portuguese slave hunters abducted a large group of Africans from Sierra Leone and shipped them to Havana, Cuba, a center for the slave trade. This abduction violated all of the treaties then in existence. So you're dealing with treaties, you're dealing with international law, you're dealing with treaties are agreements between two or more nations. So it's telling you that was illegal on that level, on the international level, and it was illegal for that ship to come into the U.S. as well. But if you don't understand history and law, you don't understand any of this. Okay, so, how's everybody doing on YouTube also? We got Walter, we got Black World, Angela, Michael Daniel, Shalonda, okay? All right, everybody share this broadcast on your social media platforms. All right, so So the first shipload of African captives to North America, prior to the 1619 project, a lot of people said it came into Virginia, Jamestown, Virginia. It's really Hampton, not Jamestown. But we know that the Spanish were taking Africans into the territory we call South Carolina, that South Carolina, Georgia area. They were doing that in 1526. This is 93 years before Jamestown, Virginia. Okay. But that's a Spanish colony, not a British colony. So different colonies under different governments are going to have different laws, and different European nations are getting involved in the transatlantic slave trade at different periods of time. So when you actually study this history, the way all of this evolves internationally and in the United States, the way it actually happened is largely different than a lot of people think that it happens. All the 9 European nations, they didn't get involved in the transatlantic slave trade all at the same time. The Portuguese were the first ones involved. The Spanish are the second ones. The British get involved later in the transatlantic slave trade. The Portuguese dominate for the first 200 years, but roughly the first 200 years. Okay, they get involved in 1441. So roughly about 1441, 1640 or so. The Portuguese dominate for the first 200 years. And to understand the transatlantic slave trade, you have to understand the history of the Africans known as the Moors. Because when the Moors go into the Iberian Peninsula, today known as Spain and Portugal, in 711 AD, and Spain and Portugal are right above Morocco. And when the Moors go in, they're civilizing Europe. They're taking in science and mathematics. They're taking in algebra. They're taking in the periodic tables. And these teachings that they're taking in, coming largely from the Nile Valley region of Africa originally, this brings Europe out of the Dark Ages. The mistake that we make is that we think that Europeans, at least during the time of the transatlantic slave trade, I'm not talking about going back to ancient Greece and Rome. The mistake that we make is that Europeans first came in contact with African people during the transatlantic slave trade, or that Europeans first came in contact with African people in 1441 when the Portuguese go into Mauritania. Okay. No, Europeans in Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, Germany, Austria, England, they were dealing with Africans for hundreds of years before that. They're dealing with the Moors. And the conflict and the wars fought between these Africans and Europeans continues into the transatlantic slave trade. It didn't begin with the transatlantic slave trade. It continues with the transatlantic slave trade. When you understand the chronology of this, and I deal with this in my online course that I teach, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, where they didn't teach you in school. Okay, how you doing, Christy and Cecilia? When you deal with this, you see the transatlantic slave trade is really a continuation of what was happening in Europe between the African Moors and Europeans. It's a continuation of that. So, Professor Kabahai Wata Kamene, some of you have seen some of my interviews with him or heard some of my interviews with him. He's in the Hidden Colors documentaries and when a few documentaries together. He's one of my teachers. He says to understand the existence of something, you must first understand the pre-existence of existence. To understand the existence of something, you must first understand the pre-existence of existence. So the way I was taught is that when we study the transatlantic slave trade, we can't start in mid-15th century. We got to deal with history before then and understand this chronology of history that leads to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. The transatlantic slave trade is not an isolated event. It didn't just fall out of the sky like rain. It didn't grow up out of the ground like flowers. It's a continuation. Okay, so this is important. So we have to reframe, I think, how we look at the transatlantic slave trade and how we've been taught to look at it. You have to understand that history prior to it to really understand it. Okay, historical events don't happen in a vacuum. They are the culmination of a sequence of historical events that take place. All right, so we see that August 20th, 1619 in Virginia, the White Line slave ship at Point Comfort, 29 Africans are exchanged for food and supplies and water. These were believed to be the Kumbundu speaking people from the area that's present day Angola. They're going to be captured. They're captured, and it's about 350 of them that are captured on the slave ship called the San Juan Batista, and around the Gulf, around Veracruz, Mexico, somewhere around there. The ship is going to be hijacked by 2 English pirate ships. Okay, the names of the English pirate ships were the White Lion and the Treasurer. And then the White Lion and the Treasurer, so they're going to take about 50 or so Africans, put them on these 2 ships. The White Lion and the Treasurer come into Virginia, okay, August 1619. And 29 Africans on the White Line slave ship are traded for food and supplies and water. Now, that's said to be the first, when African people first came to this land. Even though August 20, 1619 does happen, African people have been in this land for thousands of years before that. So if we look at, and I got to find the book here. If we look at the first Americans were Africans documented evidence by Dr. David Imhotep, and I've rearranged some of my books here. So now I have to find them after rearranging them. Yeah, right here. We look at the first Americans were Africans documented evidence by Dr. David Imhotep. We know that the Africans known as the Khoisan were here in this land we call the United States of America today. They were here going back at least 51,700 years ago, in the territory we today call South Carolina. So the Khoisan have the oldest DNA on the planet. They come from Southern Africa. They're the ancestors to the Ainu and the Twa. They go all around the world, and they come here. Okay, so yes, the transatlantic slave trade happens. That's true, but that's not when African people first came to this land. The African people, number one, we know we migrated. We didn't stay put. We migrate from the Nile Valley region of Africa into Central Africa, into West Africa, and that migration takes place much earlier than we've been told. We go into Europe. We go into areas that today we call Middle East. We go into Europe. We go into Asia. Okay. You're going to have voluntary migrations. You're going to have forced migrations. We see that the Dogon, who are in Mali and Burkina Faso, the Dogon are in Kemet, or what today we call Egypt, and they're going to migrate. There's one wave that leaves Kemet around 400 BC. There's an invasion taking place, and they leave. Dr. David Imhotep talks about this in the first Americans, where Africans documented evidence. We look at the Yoruba, who are in Nigeria. The Yoruba come from ancient Kemet also. So you're going to see Africans from the Nile Valley region of Africa migrating to Central Africa, migrating to West Africa, and going out of Africa as well. So just because we've been here in this land for tens of thousands of years, that does not mean the transatlantic slave trade did not happen. You have to understand a chronology of the last 50,000 years of history to really understand this. Also, this is a good book to read, Golden Age of the Moor. Golden Age of the Moor is edited by Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, who's an ancestor now. And this is one of the preeminent books dealing with the history of the Moors in Europe, not just Spain, but in Europe in general, from about 8th century AD to about 15th century AD. Okay, and you have essays in here by Dr. Jose Pimenta Bay, who I interviewed back in 2010, is one of the baddest scholars on the history of the Moors during this period of time, and he used to teach classes on the history of the Moors at Temple University. Last time I checked, he was at Berea College in Kentucky. You have essays from Ronoko Rashidi, Jan Carew, Dr. Wayne Chandler, Dr. John G. Jackson. Okay, so this is one of the preeminent books dealing with the history of the Moors, Golden Age of the Moor. Then Ronoko wrote his book, and I gotta find it here because I put in a bookcase. I have 4 stacks of books. I have 4 stacks of books next to me, so I put in a bookcase, and behind me a little bookcase, and I'm trying to figure out where all my books are now. I knew where they were before I put the bookcase in. I'm trying to get stuff up off the floor. So I got to find this one here. I want to show you this one here because this is a really, really good book dealing with the history of the Moors. And I read it. This is not the book I'm looking for, but this is also a good book, Introduction to African Religion by John S. Mbidi, which gives you a good overview of traditional African spiritual systems all throughout Africa. Introduction to African Religion. Okay. Where's that book? Okay, I'll find it. I'm trying to organize some things, and now I can't find it. All right, but anyway, so we'll keep going. A good book on the Amistad. That's not it. Well, this is Henry Louis Gates Jr. 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro. I thought that was my book on the Amistad, but anyway. All right, let's continue. I'll find it. It'll come up. It must be in this other stack. Oh, here it is. Yeah. This book right here. This is what I was looking for. Black Star: The African Presence in Early Europe. Black Star: The African Presence in Early Europe. Now, this is about Ronoko Rashidi. Ronoko was a friend of mine. I've interviewed him a number of times. He's in Hidden Colors too. This book right here, dealing with the history of the Moors, this book right here blow your mind. I mean, because what happened was was interviewing him. I was preparing for an interview. I think I interviewed when I interviewed him about this book, I think it was 2012. And I was reading through it to prepare for my interview with him. And then that's when, let's see, where is it in here? I'm gonna get back to the main topic, but this is still right on the topic because you got to understand this history, right? So he has like pictures of the Black Madonna and Child in Europe because the Black Madonna and Child was worshipped throughout Europe, and they still have statues today, like in Poland, Czechoslovakia. Okay, they still have pictures of that, but that comes from Asar, Offset, and Heru, who the Greeks called Osiris, Isis, and Horus. That comes from the Immaculate Conception of Virgin Birth, which is an ancient African principle that was practiced through Europe. So they were in Europe, they were worshiping the African woman in Europe. Okay, you got one from Switzerland, one from Poland, which one? Madrid, Spain, Luxembourg City, Luxembourg, right? But then I saw this picture right here. Let's see. I saw this picture right here, which caused me to start doing some more research, right? This is the flag. This is the national flag of Sardinia, Italy. Okay, Sardinia. And Sardinia is an island, okay? The national flag of Sardinia and also the national flag of Corsica. They have African Moors heads on the national flag. So it caused me to start doing some research on this. And the Moors were in those areas. And it took a monumental effort to conquer them. Originally, the flag was had the Moors heads, but they were blindfolded, signifying that they were prisoners, had conquered. So you see here, they're wearing like a headband, right? They're wearing like a headband. Originally, it was a blindfold, but because of the need to be politically correct, because of tourism, what have you, they changed the blindfold to a headband. So in my research, what I did was I started researching Sardinia, and I found that national website, the website for the country, and it's promoting tourism, things like this, right? So I go to the website, and basically on every page on the website, they have that flag with the 4 African Moors heads on it. So it was very small. If I did not already know what it was, I thought it was just, I would have just thought it was decoration. No, it's African Moors heads. So you got to go and deal with the history, understand the history of Britain, deal with things like Queen Charlotte Sophia. Again, Queen Charlotte Sophia was the wife of King George III. She was of African Moorish ancestry on her mother's side. King George III is the king that the 13 colonies are revolting against. And this leads to the American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. Queen Charlotte Sophia, right? Who Charlottesville, Virginia is named after. So when you had the August 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, with the 12 white supremacist organizations, and then it led to it led to the riot breaking out, and Heather Heyer, the white female activist, was killed. They're in the city, the white supremacists were in the city rallying to save a statue of General Robert E. Lee. And the city is named after an African woman, Queen Charlotte Sophia. And when you study the history of General Robert E. Lee, who was a general in the Civil War on behalf of Virginia, he fought on behalf of the South. He was a brutal slave owner. When you study General Robert E. Lee was against Confederate monuments and against Confederate statues, even the ones dedicated to him. Okay, and then a lot of those groups had the what they call the Confederate flag or variations of the Confederate flag, right? And when you study that flag, the flag that's on the Dukes of Hazzard car, the TV show Dukes of Hazzard, Bo and Luke Duke and Daisy and Uncle Jesse, the name of the car is General Lee, by the way. The name of the car is named after a brutal slave owner who committed treason against the U.S. and took up arms to fight against the U.S., but that's another story. That's who the car is named after, General Lee. The flag that's on top of the flag that's on top of the General Lee car on the Dukes of Hazzard is not the Confederate flag. That's the Confederate battle flag of Northern Virginia under General Robert E. Lee's army. There were 3 flags that flew over the Confederate States of America from 1861 to 1865. That flag was never one of them. So when I saw the white supremacists out there, I'm like, wait a second, you protesting, you have your rally in a city named after an African woman, Queen Charlotte Sophia. You trying to save a statue dedicated to a traitor to this country who didn't want Confederate statues and didn't want Confederate monuments, even the ones dedicated to him. After the Civil War was over, General Robert E. Lee said they need to put away the Confederate flag, or all the Confederate flags need to put those away, because the Civil War tears this country apart, largely destroys the South. And he felt that there needed to be a time of healing between the North and the South. And you can't do this. You can't do that having Confederate monuments and having Confederate flags, right? So because I sat back and watched the whole thing and I understand history, I'm sitting back, I'm saying, this is the most idiotic thing I've ever seen. You have your protest in the city named after an African woman. You're trying to save a statue, a Confederate statue, to a man who didn't want Confederate statues. And you run around with a flag that you call a Confederate flag. That's not even the Confederate flag. Read the article from theatlantic.com called The Kindly, The Myth of the Kindly General Lee, I think it is. We'll post it. Yeah, The Myth of the Kindly General Lee. The Atlantic had a big article dealing with this back at that time, breaking down like the real history of General Lee. Okay. All right. So let's continue. And then also, if you want to, my online course is all on demand. It's about 16 hours. It's broken up into 8 or 9 sessions. So it's Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade we didn't teach you in school. Okay, so we have that on sale now, $80. It's regularly $130. So online course, you can watch it with your children. We'll post a link here. It's also on the homepage of our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. All right, let's continue. Okay, Tomanika. And also everybody follows on my social media platforms. Follow me on my YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, Imhotep. Follow me on Facebook. Follow me Facebook, the African History Network. Turn on the notifications so you know when I go live. DJ Queen said, when we get our reparations, which city or country should we migrate to? If we get reparations, and the way we're going about it, I don't think we're going to get it, but that's a whole nother story. I don't see why we should leave. Some of us may repatriate back to Africa. That has its purpose. But this was our land stolen from us. We were here before Native Americans were here in this land. So why should we be the ones to leave? You know, I'm just saying, well, this was our land stolen from us. Why should we be the ones who leave? All right, let's continue because I don't want this to be a 3-hour video. So we look at indentured servants, European indentured servants, right? We hear about European indentured servants. We hear about the Irish were indentured servants, etc. So August 20, 1619, you have this taking place, right? But for most of the 17th century, European indentured servants were far more numerous in the North American British colonies than were African slaves. 1619 codified slave laws don't even exist in the British colonies. The 13 British colonies, codified slave laws don't exist. The first colony, the first British colony, I'm not talking about Spanish colonies. You're dealing with different governments. You're dealing with different laws. The first British colony to have codified slave laws is going to be Massachusetts in 1641. They don't come to Virginia in 1661. They come to the different colonies at different periods of time. So once again, the way this whole thing evolves is different than the way we think it happened. Okay. So for instance, like if you read Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett Jr., this is the 6th edition. Very good book. In the back of the book, he has milestones in history, starting with 1619. Okay. Now he could start with 1513 when Juan Garrido comes into Florida with Juan Ponce de Leon, the Spanish conquistador, and Juan Garrido was born in West Africa in 1480. Juan Garrido was probably the first African-American that we know of by name in this country. Okay. So you could start there, but he starts here. Okay, that's fine. All right. Shalana said, I truly don't think we'll get reparations. Well, this is first of all, I talked about this on my Sunday night show. Sunday, March 22nd edition of the African History Network show. One, America needs a massive history lesson because Americans are woefully ignorant of history. African Americans and white people are ignorant of history. One. Two, we have to make legal arguments for reparations. And when we deal with Article 1, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution that I laid out, that's a foundation for a legal argument. A lot of these other arguments are not legal arguments. You know, because, okay, so people say, well, we worked 246 years for free. We didn't get paid, things like this. That was the whole purpose of enslaving you. It was legal not to pay you. That was the whole purpose for enslaving you. I understand repairing the damage and all that, but when you go talk to lawmakers who write laws, the foundational law is U.S. Constitution, because nobody's talking about what happens if reparations gets passed and it gets challenged in the courts. Because if Donald Trump's Department of Justice is in court right now trying to repeal the entire Affordable Health Care Act, which is saving white people's lives, If they're trying to repeal that, you think they're not going to challenge this in the court? And Trump has nominated 1/4 of the federal judges and 2 U.S. Supreme Court judges. So a lot of times when we talk about reparations, a lot of times people mean well, but a lot of times we're focused on a wedding day and not a marriage. A wedding day is something short term. A marriage is something long term, takes long term planning. A lot of times people focus on a wedding day and not a marriage. We got to focus on understanding history and legal arguments based upon the Constitution, and legal arguments based upon an understanding of history. Okay, so one of the foundations of the legal argument is from 1808 to 1860. All those Africans that were brought in, it was illegal. You violated your own laws. Before that, all that stuff was legal. It was morally wrong, but it was legal. So that's another conversation. But page 443, 6th edition, 1641, December. Massachusetts became the first colony to give statutory recognition to slavery. Massachusetts became the first colony to give statutory recognition to slavery. Other colonies followed: Connecticut in 1650, Virginia 1661, Maryland 1663, New York and New Jersey 1664, South Carolina 1682, Rhode Island and Pennsylvania 1700, North Carolina 1715, Georgia 1750. Okay, so the different laws are hitting the different colonies at different times. We're just under the impression that they just stepped off the ships in 1619 and slavery was in all the colonies and all this. No, that's not what happened. And those 29 Africans were put into a form of indentured servitude for about 3 to 5 years because codified slave laws didn't exist. Slavery for perpetuity didn't exist in the British colonies. And then they're going to be freed after that. Some of them go on to acquire land. You know, and then you got cases of Africans coming from England, Black people coming from England, entering into indentured servitude, coming to this land, and then going on, once they're released, going on to acquire land and acquire indentured service, both Black and white. So the whole way this thing evolves is the real history is totally different than what we really think. All right, if you like this type of information, also you can donate to the African History Network, Cash App, $ the AHN Show through Cash App, $ AHN Show through Cash App, and also PayPal, paypal.me/the AHN Show, or at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Click on the yellow donate button. All my DVD lectures are at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Also, we have bundle packs like the Black Migration 1619 to 2019 bundle pack, and it's on digital download as well. So we have a lot of my lectures on digital download also. Okay. Tracy said this info can help with the argument of reparations due. Absolutely. But we have to understand how to make legal arguments. A lot of these legal arguments, a lot of people mean well. A lot of these arguments are not legal arguments. And then also, when you deal with some of these ignorant ass Republicans, especially in the House of Representatives, you're dealing with a lot of them who are ignorant of history also. That's the other thing. This is why elections have consequences. Okay, you know, so a lot of people talk about black agenda. We need a black agenda. That's true. Black agenda is what we present to candidates, not what they present to us. 1, 2, you need somebody competent to read your black agenda. Donald Trump is not somebody competent to read a black agenda. I'm telling you right now, he's not somebody competent to read a black agenda. He needs to be voted out of office. All right. And if you see my broadcast dealing with the coronavirus, this stuff is his fault, basically. There were warning signs. If you saw my Sunday night show, there were warning signs. There were warning signs coming from the intelligence community going back to January of 2020, January and February, that he was ignoring. Okay. I'm going to do another broadcast dealing with that. So look out for that. But this stuff, the overwhelming majority of the fallout from coronavirus, the economic impact, all of that, if not all of it, was basically avoidable. If you had somebody competent in office who listened to the scientists, who didn't think they knew more than the scientists, had not been declaring war on the scientists for 3 years. Somebody who was competent, used good judgment, and took proper precautions, this stuff was avoided. All right. So we see European indentured servants were far more numerous in the North American British colonies than the African slaves were in the 17th century. So we're talking about the 1600s. However, after the year 1680, the flow of indentured servants sharply declined, leading to an explosion in the African slave trade. Okay. Now, by the middle of the 18th century, slavery could be found in all 13 colonies and was at the core of the Southern colonies' agricultural economy. By the time of the American Revolution, which starts in 1775, the English importers alone have brought some 3 million captive Africans to the Americas. All right. Read the article from history.com from February 9th, 2010. Congress abolishes the African slave trade. That has some information. Now, when they say that, when they say in the article, they say that the first shipload of African captives to North America arrived at Jamestown, Virginia in August 1619. They come into the Spanish territory first in 1526. All right. So we just have to keep that in mind. Now, indentured servants first arrived in America in the decade following the settlement of Jamestown by the Virginia Company in 1607. Okay, there was the Virginia Company, and they're going to get charters. That's the word I was looking for. They get charters from King James to the London Trading Company, Virginia Trading Company, Plymouth Trading Company. They get charters to set up these colonies. Now, the idea of indentured servitude was born of a need for cheap labor. The earliest settlers soon realized that they had lots of land to care for, but no one to care for it. With passage to the colonies expensive for people except for the wealthy, the Virginia Company developed the system of indentured servitude to attract workers. Indentured servants became vital to the colonial economy. So with indentured servants, they typically work between 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage coming to the colonies, room and board, lodging, and freedom dues. They basically had contracts, and there was usually some type of compensation when they had completed their period of indentured servitude. They may be given land, they may be given financial compensation, whatever it is. Now, while the life of an indentured servant was harsh and restrictive, it was not slavery. There were laws that protected some of their rights in indentured servants. There were laws that protected some of their rights, but their life was not an easy one. And the punishment that was given out to people who were indentured servants who committed various offenses were harsher than those for non-servants. An indentured servant's contract could be extended as punishment for breaking a law, such as running away, or in the case of female servants, like, for instance, possibly becoming pregnant. Now, for those that survived the work and received their freedom package, many historians argue that they were better off than those new immigrants who came freely to this country, okay, who didn't have somebody who was providing shelter for them, providing food for them, etc. Now, their contract may have included at least 25 acres of land, a year's worth of corn, arms, weapons, guns, a cow, and new clothes. Some servants did rise to become part of the colonial elite, but for the majority of indentured servants that survived the treacherous journey by sea and the harsh conditions of life in the New World, satisfaction was a modest life as a freeman in a burgeoning colonial economy. All right, now, let me skip ahead here. So we're going to see an increase in, you see different periods of times when you have an increase in the demand for slaves and the number of African slaves. We see an increase going into the 18th century, the 1700s. Then also we see an increase in the early 1800s because of the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Okay, so Louisiana Purchase of 1803 was signed by President Thomas Jefferson, and it basically doubled the territory of the U.S. at this period of time. They're going to get about 828,000 square miles of land for less than 3 cents an acre. About 828,000 square miles of land for less than 3 cents an acre. So they're going to pay about $15 million to France for the territory that was in this country that belonged to France. This is basically going to double the territory of the U.S. and is going to increase the need for more African slaves. You go back to 1793, you had the invention of the cotton gin, Eli Whitney, the cotton gin, and then copies of the cotton gin, which make it more efficient, more cost effective to produce cotton. The cotton gin is going to remove the seeds out of cotton, which was an arduous task, a very time consuming task. So it made it more profitable, more efficient, made it faster to harvest cotton after you grow it. Picking cotton and getting the seeds out, it made it a much faster process, which lowered the cost of cotton. All right, so you're going to have, and the Louisiana Purchase takes place because the Haitians during the Haitian Revolution beat the hell out of the French, and Napoleon Bonaparte beat them so badly that France is trying to raise money. So they sell this land here. But then this increases, the sale of it to the U.S. increases the demand for African slaves. So that's 1803, and that's 5 years before 1808, January 1st, 1808, when the law that passes Congress March 2nd, 1807 goes into effect that abolishes the international transatlantic slave trade, the U.S. involvement in the international transatlantic slave trade. In 1803, with the Louisiana Purchase, you're going to have the practice of trying to keep a balance between the number of free states and the number of slaveholding states. So even though about 15 states were carved out of that 828,000 square miles of land, there's going to be about roughly, I guess, about half of them or so that are going to have slaves, and the rest is going to be free territory. All right, now, so we see Massachusetts, 1641, Virginia, 1661, codified slave laws come there. And we're going to see as demand for labor grew, so did the cost of indentured servants. As demand for labor grew, so did the cost for indentured servants. So many landowners also felt threatened by newly freed servants' demand for land. The colonial elite realized the problem of indentured servitude. Landowners turned to African slaves as a more profitable and ever renewable source of labor, and the shift from indentured servants to racial slavery had begun. Now, one of the problems with the indentured servants was that if they're white and they run away, it's easier for them to blend in with, like, white men. It's easier for them to blend with other white men or white women. You had indentured servants. From 1611 to 1783, Europe is going to empty its jail. 1783 is going to be before the American Revolutionary War. So it's easier for them to run away and blend in with other white people. But if it's African slave, it's harder for them to do that. Okay, it's harder for them to blend in. So you're gonna have that taking place, and then 1675 and 1676 in Virginia, you have Bacon's Rebellion. And Bacon's Rebellion was when African slaves united with European indentured servants. And they realized they had a common oppressor, and they fought against their common oppressor. This took place in Virginia, 1675, 1676. So it's basically going to be after that the term white is going to be basically widely adopted in the British colonies, the 13 British colonies, as a way to separate the white indentured servants from the enslaved Africans, because they want to break up that alliance. Because prior to that, so for instance, if we look at Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett Jr., prior to that, the term white wasn't really used for what we call white people. They were called Christians, or they were called English or Englishmen. It's going to be basically after Bacon's Rebellion, right around 1680, 1681. It's basically going to be after that you see the term white really being used to describe them in widespread usage. If we look at page 40 of Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett Jr., and let's see how we're coming in. How's everybody doing on Facebook and YouTube? Okay, we got Warrior on YouTube, Lightbearer, William, Blacksmith, Linda, Shalonda. Okay. If we look at page 40, about halfway down the page, it says, of all the improbable aspects of this situation, the oddest to modern blacks and whites is that white people did not seem to know that they were white. So you're talking about in the 1600s. It appears from surviving evidence that the first white colonists had no concept of themselves as what we call white people. The legal documents identified whites as Englishmen and or Christians. The word white, with its burden of arrogance and biological pride, developed late in the century, late in the 1600s, late in the 17th century, as a direct result of slavery and the organized debasement of blacks. The same point can be made from the other side of the line. For a long time in colonial America, there was no legal name to focus white anxiety. The first blacks were called blackamoors, Moors, Negers, Negers, and Negars, Negars. The word negro, a Spanish and Portuguese term for black, it could mean black or a black thing, Spanish and Portuguese. The word negro did not come into general use in Virginia until the later part of the century, later part of the 17th century, later part of the 1600s. So when we really study this history, that's page 40 of Before the Mayflower, 6th edition by Lerone Bennett Jr. So when we study this history, the way that all this stuff evolves is different than the way we think it happened. This is why I say Americans are very ignorant of history. African Americans, white Americans, very ignorant of history. All right, we got Greg Osborne, HL, Bomo on Facebook. Okay, so let's continue here. So in January 1807, with a self-sustaining population of more than 4 million African slaves already living in slave-owning states, some Southern congressmen joined with Northerners to enact the ban on the African slave trade. However, internal slave trading throughout the South remained, that was legal, that stayed legal, as I already stated. Children of enslaved Africans who were born, children who are going to be born, they're going to be slaves also. Okay. And this ensured a growing population. Now, some historians estimated up to 50,000 African slaves were illegally brought into the United States after 1808. So that period of time, 1808 to about 1860. So the Clotilda slave ship in 1860 is thought to be the last known slave ship coming into this country. That was illegal. When you study the case of the Clotilda, and it was in I think it was 2019, that they actually found the actual slave ship, the Clotilda. And there's a I did a broadcast dealing about that, did a video dealing about that. And it was a very, very detailed way they went through verifying that this was the Clotilda slave ship. But when you study that case, it was illegal for that ship to come in. And those Africans, they had to hide them in the swamp or something like that for 2 or 3 days. Because coming in there, they have to watch out for U.S. naval ships and abolitionist ships that were looking for slave ships because it's illegal. Okay. So they had to navigate through that, and they had to hide those African slaves for 2 or 3 days, something like that, in the swamp. Okay, so you have historians that estimated up to 50,000 slaves were illegally brought to the United States after 1808, mostly through Spanish Florida and Texas, before those states were admitted to the Union. All right. Now, when I interviewed Dr. Jahi Issa and Brother Reggie Marbury, and they wrote an article for Black Agenda Report back in, I think it was 2017, called "Reparations Was Dead. Here's How to Revive It," or something to that effect. There was new research that came out that suggested that that number of Africans that was brought in after 1808 is much higher. Okay. And they're estimating in like 2 or 3 million, somewhere around there. They're estimating it was much higher. A lot of the increase in the African slave population in this country after 1808 was attributed to slave breeding. Slave breeding is going to take place. It is going to increase after 1808. But no, what was happening was they were also undercounting the number of Africans that was still being brought into this country. And the international African slave trade was illegal. So in 1820, slave trading became a capital offense. In 1820, in the U.S., slave trading became a capital offense with an amendment to the 1819 Act to protect the commerce of the United States and punish the crime of piracy. The 1819 Act to punish the commerce of the United States and punish the crime of piracy. A total of 74 cases of slave trading were brought in the United States from 1837 to 1860. But few ship captains were convicted, and those who were usually convicted received, very light sentences, which they often could avoid. Now, okay, so we see the 13 colonies revolting against King George III with the American Revolution. Now, many of the founding fathers assailed slavery, singling out the slave trade from Africa for condemnation. Several of the founding fathers, however, including Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and George Mason, were slave owners. When we look at the U.S. Constitution, there were 39 signers. Some of them were slave owners, all of them were not slave owners, and some at one point owned slaves and stopped and got rid of the slaves. Alexander Hamilton didn't own slaves. Benjamin Franklin and John Jay College in the New York area is named after John Jay. At one point, they owned slaves, but stopped and then joined the Manumission Society. The Manumission Society was one of those early societies that were made up of abolitionists, largely white people who were abolitionists, who were fighting against slavery. Britannica.com has a good article dealing with founding fathers and slavery. And it breaks down the ones who did own slaves, the one who did not. It breaks down the ones who at one point owned slaves and stopped, got rid of the slaves, etc. So at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Philadelphia, 1787, spring of 1787, the slave trade emerged as an acrimonious issue. Finally, a compromise was reached with the southern states that guaranteed the continuance of the slave trade for 20 years after the adoption of the U.S. Constitution. The deal set the earliest possible expiration date as 1808, one which Congress met. And that's based upon Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution. That was a compromise, okay? It was a compromise between the various states to put off abolishing the international transatlantic slave trade for 20 years. Okay. All right, how you doing, Tamanika? Okay, so let's continue here. So Great Britain also banned the African slave trade in 1807, but the trade of African slaves to Brazil and Cuba continued until the 1860s. And then, so the Great Britain does it around 1807, U.S. 1808. There's a good article from, was this Politico, which, yeah, Politico.com, Politico.com, Politico, Politico.com. Congress votes to ban slave importation, March 2nd, 1807. Congress votes to ban slave importation, March 2nd, 1807. So check that out. Now, what's going to happen is you're going to see northern states largely abolish slavery before southern states do. So after the American Revolutionary War, as slave labor was not a crucial element of the northern economy, most northern states passed legislation to abolish slavery. Okay, so American Revolutionary War ends 1783. Then you have the, so 1775, 1783, you have the U.S. Constitution, 1787, it's ratified 1788. You have the first census in 1790. So you're going to have a lot of northern states that abolished slavery altogether after all of that, after the Constitution and all of that. And there's a fight to keep a balance between the number of slaveholding states in this country and the number of free states. So after the American Revolutionary War, as slave labor was not a crucial element of the northern economy, because the majority of your plantations are going to be in the South. Okay. A lot of that has to do with climate. Okay, a warmer climate in the South. The other thing is important to note is that there were at least 262 skills, trades, and crafts that African people had in this country from 1619 to 1865. There were at least 262 skills, trades, and crafts. So even though some Africans lived and worked on plantations, all of them didn't do that. We were blacksmiths, we were coppersmiths, we were barrel makers, we were barbers, we were engineers, we worked in sawmills, a lot of times, a lot of dangerous work. It's work that we did also. But so all African slaves did not work and live on plantations. A lot of them did. Okay. And you're going to see different things are taking place at different periods of time in history. And a lot of it has to do with region. Okay. A lot has to do with the region that you're in as well. And the period of time the period of time that we're talking about. Was this before the cotton gin was invented in 1793 or after the cotton gin? Was this before the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 or after the Louisiana Purchase? So most northern states after the American Revolutionary War are going to pass legislation to abolish slavery at different periods of time. However, in the South, the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 made cotton a major industry and sharply increased the need for slave labor. Tension arose between the North and the South as tension arose between the North and the South and between slave and free states. Okay. Let me rephrase that. As new states are coming into the Union, there's a debate over whether or not they should be free or slave states, whether they should allow slavery in these states. Okay. That's going to take place. And then later, we go to 1852, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Well, 1854, Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act dealt with leaving it up to the people who live in those states out west that are coming into the Union, leaving it up to them to determine whether or not they have slavery, as opposed to it being dictated to them by the federal government. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 is going to be because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act largely that later in 1854, you're going to have a political party that's founded called the Republican Party. The Republican Party was founded by groups of abolitionists who are fighting to end slavery, and it's largely as a backlash to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. 2 years before that, you have a book by Harriet, a novel, a book of fiction by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. And this book is going to be called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to give a huge boost to the abolitionist movement. And this book becomes an international bestseller. It's going to sell 300,000 copies in this first year. And the book exposes really America to the horrors of slavery, okay, and the brutality of slavery. The central character in Uncle Tom's Cabin, the character of Uncle Tom, is based upon the real life of a former slave named Josiah Henson. Josiah Henson was a slave in Maryland with his family, and he and his family are going to run away. They go on the Underground Railroad. They end up going into Canada. And he becomes a Methodist minister and an educator, and he works on the Underground Railroad to free enslaved Africans also. He wrote an autobiography. Okay, he's from Maryland. He wrote an autobiography, and Harriet Beecher Stowe read his autobiography, and she patterned the character of Uncle Tom, the fictitious character of Uncle Tom. She patterned after him. In the term Uncle Tom as a derogatory term is an incorrect term, because when you read Uncle Tom's Cabin, Uncle Tom was the slave who refused to beat Black women. He was the slave who took cotton out of his sack and put it into the sack of other slaves so they wouldn't get a beating. He's going to end up being beaten to death in the book by a slave master. Simon Legree was the slave master. But the usage of the term Uncle Tom somehow got twisted. It may have something to do with there was a movie that came out about 1912. It's about 28 minutes long called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was in black and white, of course. It's 1912. But it depicted Uncle Tom in that movie as being very docile and obedient, subservient, dim-witted. So that may be how the usage of the term Uncle Tom got really twisted around. The slave that went behind the slave master and the slave that would tell on other slaves, etc. In that book, his name was Sambo, okay, in Uncle Tom's Cabin. All right, so we see in the South, because of the cotton gin and copies of the cotton gin, this is going to increase the need for slave labor. It causes cotton to become a major industry. Now, tensions are going to arise between the North and the South as the slave or free status of new states was debated. In January of 1807, with a self-sustaining population of over 4 million slaves in the South, some Southern congressmen joined with the North in voting to abolish the African slave trade, an act that became effective January 1st, 1808. So the widespread trade of African slaves within the South, as I stated before, was still legal, however. So when we look at the Amistad Slave Ship, right, that case goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. In February of 1839, Portuguese slave hunters abducted a large group of Africans from Sierra Leone and shipped them to Havana, Cuba, which was a center for the slave trade. So this abduction violated all of the treaties then in existence. You're going to have treaties like the Anglo-Spanish treaties of 1817 and 1835, because different European nations are entering into treaties to abolish the international transatlantic slave trade. Now, they'll still have slaves in their respective colonies. So abcnews.go.com, which is the official website of ABC News, abcnews.go.com has a really good timeline of history. This is timeline of Atlantic slave trade. And you see other good timelines. Blackpast.org has a really good one that I use also. But if we go to 1817, Britain and Spain signed a treaty prohibiting the slave trade. British naval vessels, British naval ships, are given right to search suspected slave ships. Still, loopholes in the treaty undercut its goals, and the slave trade grows with the slave economics of Cuba and Brazil expanding rapidly. So that's 1817. Then we go to 1835. The Anglo-Spanish agreement on the slave trade is renewed and enforcement tightened. British cruisers are authorized to arrest suspected Spanish slavers and bring them before mixed commissions in Sierra Leone and Havana. Okay, so, and then 1836, Portugal, they're going to ban the slave trade. This is a good timeline of history they have here. So when we look at 1839, this is going to violate these treaties, okay? Because they're Cuba is what's going to happen is that they're going to be sold in Cuba, okay? They're captured in Portugal, sold in Cuba. All right. So the abduction of these Africans from Sierra Leone and then shipped to Cuba, which was the center, a center for the slave trade. This abduction violated all of the existing treaties at the time. Two Spanish plantation owners, Pedro Montez and Jose Ruiz, purchased 53 Africans and put them on board the Cuban schooner called the Amistad to ship them to a Caribbean plantation. On July 2nd, 1839, the Africans seized the ship, okay, in a mutiny. They killed the captain and the cook and ordered Pedro Montez and Jose Ruiz to sail them back to Africa. And what would happen was, in the daytime, they would sail towards the navigators would sail towards Africa. The Montez and Ruiz, they were towards Africa. At night, they would sail towards the U.S. Okay, and they're going to end up in the U.S. So during the day, Ruiz and Montez complied with the orders from the African slaves, from the Africans, to sail back to Africa. But at night, they would turn the vessel in a northerly direction toward U.S. waters. On August 24th, 1839, after almost nearly 2 difficult months at sea, during which time more than a dozen Africans had perished, what became known as the black schooner, the quote unquote black schooner, was first spotted by American vessels, American ships. The Amistad was seized off Long Island, New York, by the U.S. brig called Washington. The schooner, its cargo, the Amistad, the schooner, its cargo, and all on board were taken to New London, Connecticut. The plantation owners were freed, and the Africans were imprisoned on charges of murder. Now, the murder charges are going to be dismissed, but the Africans continued to be held in confinement, and the case went to trial in federal district court in Connecticut. The plantation owners, government of Spain, and captain of the ship called Washington each claimed rights to the Africans or compensation. Okay, the captain of the ship Washington, which was the U.S. brig, okay, the Washington. So President Martin Van Buren was president at the time. President Van Buren was in favor of extraditing the Africans to Cuba. However, abolitionists in the North opposed extradition and raised money to defend the Africans. All right. And we know the leader of the rebellion was Joseph St. All right. And a lot of people who saw the movie Amistad in 1997 remember that Djimon Hounsou portrayed Joseph St. But a lot of people saw the movie but didn't understand the legal foundation for them winning their freedom. That goes back to Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution, which is why Congress passed the bill March 2nd, 1807 to abolish the international slave trade. And this is why it went into effect January 1st, 1808. But that then ties into this U.S. Supreme Court case of the Amistad in 1841, which leads to them being free because it was illegal for them to be captured. 1, because it violated international treaties. 2, it was illegal for them to be brought into this country because it was illegal for the ship to come into this country because the international transatlantic slave trade was made illegal by Congress. So had it not been for the actions of the abolitionists in the United States, the issues related to the Amistad might have ended quietly in an admiralty court. But they used the incident as a way to expose the evils of slavery and generate significant opposition to the practice. And we saw one of the abolitionists in the movie Amistad was portrayed by Morgan Freeman. Okay, so to make a long story short here, the district court ruled that the case fell within federal jurisdiction and that the claims to the Africans as property were not legitimate because they were illegally held as slaves. The U.S. District Attorney filed an appeal to the Supreme Court. And this case goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. So in the U.S. Supreme Court trial of 1841, the Africans were represented by former U.S. President and descendant of American revolutionaries, John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was the sixth president. He was the son of the second president, John Adams. Okay. Preparing for his appearance before court, former President John Quincy Adams requested papers from the lower courts 1 month before the proceedings opened. For eight and a half hours, the 73-year-old John Quincy Adams passionately and eloquently defended the Africans' right to freedom on both legal and moral grounds, referring to treaties prohibiting the slave trade and to the Declaration of Independence. The Supreme Court decided in favor of the Africans, stating that they were free individuals kidnapped and transported illegally, and that they never had been slaves. This is a U.S. Supreme Court ruling. When you go to archives.gov, archives.gov is the National Archives, and you search for Amistad, because I went there and I pulled up the information on the Amistad and read through all the information. They have some of the primary sources. They have some of the court documents there at the National Archives dealing with the Amistad case. This is a landmark U.S. Supreme Court case. And it tells you here, in February of 1839, Portuguese slave hunters abducted a large group of Africans from Sierra Leone and shipped them to Havana, Cuba, a center for the slave trade. This abduction violated all the treaties then in existence. This is tying right in the law, tying in the law and history. Okay, so check that out. I know a lot of children are out of school now. You're looking for something to do. You can go online and research this. All right. And this ties into history and law. This ties into history of slavery, and better understanding this history, better understanding law. So Supreme Court decided in favor of the Africans, stating that they were free individuals kidnapped and transported illegally. And the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that they had never been slaves. Senior Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, S-T-O-R-Y, wrote and read the decision. He said, quote, "It was the ultimate right of all human beings in extreme cases to resist oppression and to apply force against ruinous injustice," end quote. The opinion asserted the Africans' right to resist unlawful slavery. So the court ordered the immediate release of the Amistad Africans. The abolitionists first sought damage compensation for them, but even John Quincy Adams, former president, had to agree with had to agree that despite months of captivity, because bail had been denied, the regular judicial process had detained the Africans, and liability for false imprisonment hinged only on whether the officials' acts were, quote, malicious and without probable cause, end quote. Okay, so former President John Quincy Adams, who defended them, disagreed with compensation. So to achieve equity, John Quincy Adams suggested that the federal government finance the captives' return back to Africa. But President John Tyler, so when the Amistad ship is captured, the Africans are captured in 1839. President Martin Van Buren is president then. But by the time this gets to the U.S. Supreme Court, another election happens, and President John Tyler is going to be the sitting president. T-Y-L-E-R. He's not a very popular president, John Tyler. So to achieve equity, John Quincy Adams suggested that the federal government finance the captives' return back to Africa. Okay. Current President President John Tyler, who was a Virginia slaveholder himself. He was a president and a slave owner at the same time. He refused this on grounds that, as Chief Justice Story had ruled, no law authorized such action to finance, to pay for them to be sent back to Africa. All right. So to charter a vessel for the long trip to Sierra Leone, the abolitionists raised money from private donations, public exhibitions of the Africans, and contributions from the Union Missionary Society, which African Americans had formed in Hartford, Connecticut, to found a Christian mission in Africa. On November 5th, 1841, the remaining 35 Amistad captives, okay, accompanied by James Covey and 5 missionaries, departed from New York for Africa on a small sailing vessel named the Gentleman. The British governor of Sierra Leone welcomed them the following January, almost 3 years after their initial incarceration by slave traders. Okay, so that is, there's a good article dealing with the Amistad from NavyTimes.com, August 25th, 2019. Mutiny on the Amistad. All we want is make us free. Mutiny on the Amistad. All we want is make us free. That's from NavyTimes.com. That's a really good article. Then FaceToFaceAfrica.com has an article from November 25th, 2018. This Sierra Leonean man led the Amistad Slave Revolt and won his freedom in a U.S. court in 1841. This Sierra Leonean man led the Amistad Slave Revolt and won his freedom in U.S. court in 1841. Okay, so that's a good article dealing with the Amistad. And then there's a book on the Amistad. Oh, here it is right here. I'm trying to I rearranged some of this stuff here, and now I have to find where I put my books. This is by Dr. Howard Jones. Mutiny on the Amistad by Dr. Howard Jones. The events that inspired the major motion picture. Okay, this is a really deep book dealing with the history, the Amistad, the slave, the mutiny, the slave revolt, and then the subsequent trials also. Then also read the piece from history.com, March 2nd, 1807. March 2nd, 1807, Congress abolishes the African slave trade. March 2nd, 1807, Congress abolishes the African slave trade. All right, African-American business owners, post the name of your business here on the thread of the broadcast. Email us at customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com, customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. We'll let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network. We have a special promotion going on right now. Buy 1 month, get 2 months free. We can get you up and running today. Email me at customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. All right, so a lot of people are looking for various types of holistic products, whether it's soaps, whether it's natural toothpaste. SageandElmApothecary.com. SageandElmApothecary.com is the website you want to visit. They create unique products, especially with you in mind. Their holistic approach to self-care, formulate their product inventory. They have over 60 products, including beautifully handcrafted soaps, natural toothpaste, hydrating oils, deodorant, face masks, shampoos, conditioners, and more. Visit their website, SageandElm, ELM, apothecary.com, APOTHECARY. You can order their products there. Also find out about their pop-up shops and vending events that they attend. Their current promotion right now, they have a special promotion for African History Network members and listeners. Use promo code AHN Spring 20, AHN Spring 20, and get 20% off your order. Now, we know that even though all this craziness is taking place with coronavirus, we know that some people are still traveling. You may be driving, you may rent a car and drive, okay, which is advisable because I ain't flying now. Some people may still fly, but I ain't flying. I'm gonna drive wherever I go. But wherever you go, carry your culture with you. And you can do this with blacklionleather.com. Now, blacklionleather.com is a very unique company. They sell leather travel accessories for the culturally inspired African-American traveler. They are 100% African-American owned and operated. Their motto is carry your culture, carry your culture. So visit their website, blacklionleather.com. You can see the types of accessories that you have there. You can purchase them as well. Let them know you found out about this from the African History Network. And because more people at home right now, they may want to, people have more time. They want to work out. They want to get in shape. Summer is coming up. We're already in the spring. Summer's coming up. This year is going by quickly, right? And then also you want to exercise with your children, because a lot of people are trying to figure out what to do with their children. You know, a lot of people, being that a lot of the schools are closed, they're realizing how important teachers are. And, you know, how important teachers are in their lives to like take care of their children, you know, look after their children when parents are at work. But SheRanHerselfFit.com. SheRanHerselfFit.com. Their website is to inspire and motivate women to make healthy lifestyle choices. They are a brand that promotes women living a healthy lifestyle by making small sacrifices in their daily routine and changing their diet. By doing this, you can combat many of the different diseases that are prevalent in the African-American community. Now, the owner of SheRanHerselfFit.com, her name is Felicia. Felicia lost over 200 pounds by changing her diet and running. And when you go to the website, you can see before and after pictures. Now, running may not be your motivation. That may not be what you want to do to exercise, but you want to find out what drives you to be fit. This is an apparel company, so they have apparel that you can purchase for working out, for getting fit in 2020. So visit their website, SheRanHerselfFit.com, SheRanHerselfFit.com. All right, post your questions here. We'll go to some of your questions here quickly. And then also, if you like this type of information, you can donate to the African History Network, $, the AHN Show through Cash App, $, the AHN Show through Cash App, and paypal.me/ the AHN Show, paypal.me/ the AHN Show. Okay, so how's everybody doing? Battling coronavirus and the economic impact, the fallout from it. You know, some people are working from home now. Some people can't work from home. Let's see here. Okay. How you doing, Shalonda? Now, what was it you want me to say again, Shalonda? Are you a teacher? A lot of people take teachers for granted. My mother taught 5 decades. My mother was a teacher for 5 decades. A lot of people take teachers for granted. It's like, oh, a situation like this, and you got to be at home with your children 5 days a week. I mean, 7 days a week now, but 5 days a week. Oh, you realize how important teachers were. Okay, Ruth in Atlanta, Tamanika. Okay, listen to the African History Network show Sundays, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We usually broadcast from the studios at 9:10 a.m. on Superstation WFDF. But since they're going to be shut down for a few weeks for the coronavirus, because Governor Gretchen Whitmer here in Michigan, signed an executive order for a stay-in Michigan for about 3 weeks going to April 13th. So the radio station is shut down. They're just re-airing old episodes. So I'll be broadcasting here in this studio Sundays, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's not going to That's not going to stop me. All right, Carl. Okay, thanks, Carl. Let's see here. And then I'll be doing more broadcasts updating you on what's going on with coronavirus. I'm going to do another one very soon dealing with the Congressional Black Caucus. The Congressional Black Caucus has laid out a 10-page agenda of what they want in this $2 trillion bill, because the House representatives, they're putting together their own version of the bill. Nancy Pelosi's already said that. And the Congressional Black Caucus has, they put together an agenda of policies that they want in this $2 trillion bill that benefit the African-American community. I've been going through reading it. It's deep. Okay. It is deep. All right, guys, look, hey, we're going to get out of here. Follow us on our Facebook page, The African History Network. Follow us on our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep. Turn on notifications so you know when we go live. You can order all of my DVD lectures and digital downloads at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Also, the online course that I teach is available. We have it it's on demand. It's in digital download format. As soon as you register for it, you can watch all around the world. It's called Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa. The Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. So I'm doing a PowerPoint presentation. We have articles, book references. We deal with thousands of years of history. You can use it with your children also. You can watch from around the world. That's on sale, $80, regularly $130. All right, so look, we're going to get out of here. Hey, remember the African History Network, we focus on educating, empowering, and inspiring people of African descent throughout the diaspora and around the world, because right now it's correct wrong behavior. It's not over till we win. Wakanda forever. We'll talk to you next time. Peace.